I was standing in the feed shed when Banjo came through the home paddock gate at full gallop, riderless and wild-eyed in the rain. The horse shouldn't have been moving like that, not after 3 days out with Tommy on a routine fence check. I dropped the chaff bag and stepped into the downpour, squinting through the grey sheets that had been hammering Wirralong Station since Tuesday. Banjo pulled up hard near the water trough, sides heaving, and that's when I saw it. Blood, dark and fresh, streaked across his shoulders and down his chest. The gelding wasn't limping, wasn't favoring anything, just standing there with his head low and his eyes showing too much white. I moved in slow, talking quiet the way you do with spooked horses, got my hand on his neck and felt him trembling under the wet coat. The blood wasn't his. I checked him over twice to be sure. No cuts, no punctures, nothing that would explain the amount of red soaking into his hide. The reins were gone, snapped off close to the bit, and the saddle sat crooked, with one stirrup leather torn clean through. Tommy's water canteen was still tied to the D-ring, half full. His rifle scabbard hung empty. I got Banjo into the stable and grabbed my phone, hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. 3 days Tommy had been out. 3 days, and I'd told myself the storm had him holed up somewhere sensible, waiting it out like any bloke with half a brain would. But Tommy Reichert had been working Wirralong for 6 years, knew every bore and gully and stand of mulga between here and the back boundary. He didn't get lost, and he didn't spook easy. The phone rang 4 times before Sarah picked up at the homestead. "Dave, you all right?" "Banjo just came in," I said. Covered in blood. "Tommy's not with him." The line went quiet for a beat. "How bad?" "Horse is fine. Blood's not his." I heard her breath catch. "I'm calling Phil and the Hendersons. We need people out now." "Storm's not done yet." "I don't care about the bloody storm, Sarah. Tommy's been gone since Monday." She didn't argue after that. I threw a rug over Banjo and left him with hay he wasn't interested in, then headed back to the house to grab my kit. The rain eased to a drizzle by the time Phil Cartwright's ute pulled into the yard, followed 10 minutes later by Greg and Monica Henderson in their patrol. We stood in the machinery shed with the maps spread across the bonnet of my truck, rain dripping through the hole in the roof we'd been meaning to patch since April. "Tommy was checking the northern fence line," I said, tracing the route with one finger, out past Stringybark Creek, maybe as far as the old airstrip if he had time. Phil scratched at his beard, eyes narrow. "That's a big stretch of country, could be anywhere between here and the back gate." "Banjo came from the east," I said. "Came through the home paddock gate, not the stock route. That puts him coming back through the creek system, not the main track." Greg leaned in, tapping the map where the dry creek beds converged near the limestone ridge. "Creek's been running since Tuesday. Tommy might have tried to cross before it came up. Or got caught on the wrong side," Monica added. "Either way, we follow Banjo's trail. Horse came home for a reason." I nodded, folding the map. "We've got maybe 4 hours of good light left, even with the cloud. I want 2 vehicles. Phil, you're with me. Greg and Monica, you take the southern fork in case he doubled back." "What about the SES?" Monica asked. "I rang them before I came out," Phil said. "They're stretched thin, got 2 crews working a road washout near Emerald, said they'd send someone when they can." I felt my jaw tighten. "Then it's on us. Grab your radios and spare batteries. If anyone finds anything, call it in straight away." We geared up fast. Water, first aid kits, rope, tarps. Phil threw a stretcher in the back of my truck just in case, and nobody said what we were all thinking. The blood on Banjo wasn't a good sign. The storm had turned the roads to mud, but the track out to the creek system was mostly gravel and hardpan, rutted and slick but passable. I drove with both hands tied on the wheel, watching the wipers struggle against the drizzle. Phil sat quiet beside me, scanning the scrub through the passenger window. "You think he's hurt?" Phil said after a while. "I think something happened," I said. "Something bad enough that his horse bolted without him. Tommy's not the kind to get thrown. No, he's not." We reached the creek crossing 20 minutes later, where the dry bed had turned into a shallow brown torrent, maybe 30 meters wide. I stopped the truck and got out, boots sinking into the wet sand. The water was moving fast but not deep, knee-high at most. On the far bank I could see Banjo's tracks coming down through the scrub, clear as day in the soft ground. Phil waded in first, testing the current, and I followed with the rifle slung over my shoulder. The water was cold and full of silt, tugging at my legs. We made it across and started following the hoof prints back through the stand of she oak and bottlebrush that lined the creek. Banjo had been moving fast. The prints were deep and spaced wide, dirt kicked up behind. 100 meters upstream, the tracks veered away from the water and into the scrub, heading toward the limestone ridge that marked the edge of the old cattle run. That's when I saw the first sign something was wrong. A torn piece of oilskin, Tommy's color, caught on a low branch. I pulled it free and held it up. Phil swore under his breath. He came through here in a hurry. We kept moving, following the tracks up the slope toward the ridgeline. The scrub thinned out, replaced by spinifex and scattered rocks, and the ground turned hard and uneven. Banjo's prints disappeared into the stone, but I could see scuff marks and a broken branch where something or someone had pushed through fast. Then Phil stopped and pointed. There, at the base of the ridge, half hidden by a collapse of limestone slabs and overgrown with creeper, was a gap in the rock face, not a natural cave. Too square, too deliberate. I moved closer and saw the edges of old concrete, weathered and cracked, and the remnants of a steel frame set into the stone. A door, or what was left of one. War era, Phil said quietly. Observation post maybe. I heard the army had a few scattered out here during the Pacific campaign. I crouched near the entrance and saw what made my chest tighten. Boot prints, fresh, leading inside. 2 sets going in. Only one coming out. And smeared across the concrete threshold, already drying in the humid air, was blood. Not much, but enough. I pulled my torch and clicked it on, shining the beam into the dark. The passage beyond was narrow, sloping down into the earth, with old timber props shoring up the ceiling. The air that drifted out smelled like damp stone and something else. Smoke, maybe, or old sweat. Phil radioed Greg and Monica, gave them our position, told them what we'd found. Then he looked at me, and I saw the same thing in his face that I felt in my gut. Tommy was down there. And he wasn't alone. I didn't wait for Greg and Monica to catch up. I stepped through the gap in the limestone, ducking under the sagging steel frame, and let the torch beam carve a path through the dark. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the ceiling brushed the top of my head. Old timber props lined the walls, gray with rot and speckled with mold, and the floor sloped down at a steep angle, slick with condensation. Phil followed close behind, his breathing loud in the confined space. The air was thick and still, no circulation, and it carried that smell I'd caught at the entrance. Sweat, smoke, something organic and stale. The torch beam picked out details as we moved. Rust stains on the concrete, old wiring stapled to the timber, a faded stencil on the wall that read, RAAF OBSV Post 7. The boot prints were clear in the dust and silt on the floor. 2 sets, like I'd seen outside. One pair of prints was large, heavy-soled work boots, treads worn smooth. The other was smaller, lighter. Tommy's boots, I was sure of it. They led deeper into the passage, side by side at first, then staggered, overlapping, like they'd been moving fast or unevenly. At one point the smaller prints skidded, a long scuff mark where someone had lost their footing. Phil touched my shoulder and pointed. On the wall, at chest height, a smear of something dark. Blood, still tacky. I felt my jaw tighten but kept moving. The passage opened after 20 meters into a wider space, a room carved out of the limestone and reinforced with concrete walls. The ceiling was higher here, maybe 2.5 meters, with old light fixtures hanging useless from their mounts. In the corner, someone had set up a camp. A canvas swag, unrolled and slept in, with a dirty blanket kicked to one side. A small gas burner, the kind you'd take camping, sitting on a flat rock next to a dented billy and a tin mug. A cardboard box with tinned food, beans, spaghetti, corned beef, and a half-empty water jerry. And on the ground beside the swag, Tommy's satellite phone. The screen was cracked, but the case was unmistakable. Bright orange, the station logo stamped on the back. I picked it up and tried to power it on. Nothing. Phil moved past me, scanning the rest of the room with his torch. There, he said, voice tight. On the far side of the room, tucked into an alcove, was a second camp. Older, more established. A foam mattress on a wooden pallet, a sleeping bag patched with duct tape, and a plastic crate serving as a table. On top of the crate, a notebook, a pen, a packet of rolling tobacco, and a small photo frame, face down. Phil picked up the notebook and flipped it open. The handwriting was small and cramped, the ink faded in places, dates going back months, lists of supplies, notes about weather, sketches of the tunnel layout. And on the first page, a name written in block letters, J. Pendleton. I felt the air go out of my lungs. Jack Pendleton. Station hand who'd worked at Wirralong 2 years ago, quiet bloke, kept to himself. He'd walked off the job one morning after a blue with one of the contractors, left his gear in the bunkhouse, and never came back. We'd assumed he'd hitched a ride to town and moved on. No one had filed a missing person report because Jack didn't have family, didn't leave a forwarding address, and didn't seem the type to stick around when things got tense. But he'd been here, living in this shelter, hidden beneath the dry creek for God knows how long. Phil set the notebook down and picked up the photo frame, turned it over. The glass was cracked, but the picture was clear. A young woman and a little boy, maybe 3 or 4, standing in front of a weatherboard house. Jack's family, maybe. Or someone he'd lost. Jesus, Phil said quietly. I moved back to Tommy's camp and crouched beside the swag. His pack was there, half unpacked, with a spare shirt, a water bottle, and a rolled oilskin jacket. I checked the pockets and found his wallet, driver's license still inside, and a folded piece of paper. I opened it, a hand-drawn map of the station's western boundary, with the creek bed marked, and a rough sketch of the limestone ridge. Tommy had been out here looking for stray cattle probably, and stumbled onto the shelter by accident. Maybe he'd seen the entrance and climbed down to check it out, or maybe the storm had driven him to find cover. Either way, he'd run into Jack, and Jack hadn't wanted to be found. I stood and scanned the room again, looking for anything that might tell me where they'd gone. The boot prints continued past Tommy's swag, toward the back of the room, where another passage opened in the far wall. This one was narrower than the first, rougher, more like a natural fissure in the limestone that had been widened just enough to crawl through. The beam of my torch barely reached 10 meters before the dark swallowed it. Phil came up beside me, his face pale in the torchlight. You reckon they're still down there? Only one set of prints came back out, I said. And Tommy's phone is here. Could be Jack's keeping him deeper in. Or Tommy's hurt and couldn't make it back. Phil's radio crackled, Greg's voice breaking through the static. David, we're at the entrance. What's your status? Phil keyed the mic. We're in the main chamber. Found 2 camps. One's Tommy's, one's older. Looks like Jack Pendleton's been living down here. A pause, then Greg again, his tone sharp. Jack Pendleton. The bloke who walked off 2 years ago? Yeah, and there's blood. Not much, but it's here. Boot prints lead deeper into the system. 2 in, 1 out. You going after them? Phil looked at me. I glanced back at the narrow passage, the dark beyond, and felt the weight of the rifle on my shoulder. We're going in, I said. Tell Monica to stay topside and keep the radio clear. If we're not back in an hour, call emergency services and tell them we need extraction and medical support. Copy that. Phil clipped the radio back to his belt and pulled a second torch from his pack, checked the batteries. You sure about this? Tommy's down there, I said. And if he's still alive, we're not leaving him. Phil nodded, his jaw set. We moved toward the passage, and I shone my torch into the gap. The walls were rough limestone, wet with seepage, and the floor sloped down at a sharper angle than the first tunnel. The air smelled different here, colder, damper, with a faint metallic edge that made my skin crawl. I ducked through the opening and started down, one hand on the wall to keep my balance. The passage twisted after a few meters, and the ceiling dropped low enough that I had to crouch. Phil's breathing echoed behind me, tight and shallow. The boot prints were harder to follow here, smudged and faint on the wet stone, but I could still see them. 2 sets, moving together, one slightly ahead of the other. At one point the passage widened into a small chamber, barely large enough to stand in, and I saw something that made my stomach knot. Scrape marks on the floor, like someone had been dragged. A torn piece of fabric, Tommy's shirt, I thought, caught on a sharp edge of rock, and smeared across the stone, fresh enough to still glisten. More blood. Phil swore under his breath. I kept moving, following the passage as it curved deeper into the earth, the darkness pressing in on all sides, the only sound, our boots on wet stone, and the faint drip of water somewhere ahead. And then, from somewhere in the black below I heard it, a voice, faint, hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably human. Help. I stopped, raising a fist. Phil froze behind me, his torch beam swinging to meet mine. The voice came again, weaker this time. Down here. I moved forward faster now, the passage opening into another chamber, this one larger, with a ceiling high enough to stand. My torch swept the space and caught him. Tommy. He was slumped against the far wall, his left leg stretched out at an awkward angle, his face pale and slick with sweat. His shirt was torn, the fabric dark with blood along his side, and his hands were tied behind him with what looked like baling twine. His eyes squinted against the torchlight, and for a second he didn't seem to recognize me. Then his mouth moved, a dry rasp. "David." I crossed the chamber in 3 strides and knelt beside him, pulling the knife from my belt to cut the twine. Phil was right behind me, checking Tommy's pulse, his hands steady. "Tommy, mate, talk to me," I said, sawing through the cord. "Where are you hurt?" "Ribs," he said, his voice thin. "Maybe broken. Ankles buggered. I twisted it running." I cut the last strand, and his hands came free, red welts across his wrists. He winced as he brought them forward, flexing his fingers. Phil pulled a water bottle from his pack and held it to Tommy's lips. "Slow," Phil said. "Not too much at once." Tommy took a sip, then another, his eyes closing for a moment. When he opened them again, he looked past me, toward the passage we'd come through. "Jack," he said. "He's still here." "We know," I said. "We found the shelter." "Your swag, the journal, where is he now?" "Don't know. He left maybe an hour ago. Said he needed to think, said he didn't want to hurt me, but he couldn't let me leave." Tommy's breathing hitched, and he gritted his teeth against the pain. "I stumbled onto the shelter 3 nights ago, during the storm. I was chasing a stray heifer near the creek crossing, and the ground gave way, fell straight into the entrance tunnel. When I got my bearings, I saw the camp. Thought it was just old supplies, maybe left over from the war. Then Jack stepped out of the dark." "What did he do?" Phil asked. Tommy shook his head. "Panicked. Said I couldn't tell anyone he was here. Said if people knew, they'd come for him. I tried to calm him down, told him we could sort it out. But he grabbed me, tied me up, dragged me back here. I think he was planning to wait until I promised to keep quiet, then let me go, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe I'd keep my word." I glanced at the passage behind us, the beam of my torch sweeping the shadows. "Did he say why he's been hiding down here?" "Debts," Tommy said. "And something legal. Wouldn't say what. But he's scared, David. Really scared. Said he had nowhere else to go." Phil checked Tommy's ankle, his face tight. "It's swollen. Maybe a fracture. We need to get him out of here." I nodded, and keyed the radio. "Greg, you copy?" Static. Then his voice, faint but clear. "Copy, David. We've got Tommy. He's alive, injured but stable. We're bringing him up. ETA, 10 minutes. Copy that. Monica's calling emergency services now. They're dispatching a chopper from Longreach. ETA, 45 minutes. Good. Tell her we've got one more down. Jack Pendleton. He's somewhere in the tunnels, and he's unstable. We're going to try to bring him out too, but if we can't, police need to be ready." A pause, then Greg's voice again, quieter. "You sure that's smart, David?" "He's not violent," I said, glancing at Tommy, "just desperate. If we leave him down here, he'll run deeper, and we might never find him." "Your call." I clipped the radio back and looked at Phil. "Help me get Tommy on his feet. We'll take him as far as the main chamber, then I'm coming back for Jack." Phil's jaw tightened, but he nodded. We got Tommy upright, his arms slung over my shoulder, his weight shifting awkwardly as he tried to keep pressure off his bad ankle. He sucked in a sharp breath but didn't complain. We started back up the passage, moving slow, our torches lighting the wet stone ahead. The scrape marks, the blood, the torn fabric, all of it felt heavier now, knowing what had happened, knowing Jack was still down here somewhere, watching or hiding or planning his next move. When we reached the main chamber, Monica was waiting at the entrance with Greg, her face tight with worry. She stepped forward the moment she saw Tommy, helping Phil ease him down onto the blanket they'd spread across the floor. "You're all right," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "You're all right, mate?" Tommy nodded, his eyes half closed, exhausted. I turned to Greg. "He say anything about where Jack might be?" "Only that there's another tunnel," Tommy murmured, his voice barely audible. "Opposite side of the second chamber. Narrow." barely wide enough to crawl through. That's where he came from the first time I saw him. I glanced at Phil, then back at the dark passage we'd just climbed out of. "I'm going back," I said. Greg shook his head. "David, mate, you've got Tommy. Let the cops handle it. By the time they get here, he'll be gone," I said. "And if he runs deeper into the system, we might never pull him out. He's been living rough for 2 years, Greg. He's sick, he's scared, and he's not thinking straight. If there's a chance I can talk him out, I have to try." Phil stood, brushing dust off his knees. "Then I'm coming with you." I didn't argue. We checked our torches, made sure the radios were set, and I slung the rifle back over my shoulder. Monica handed us each a bottle of water, her face pale. "Be careful," she said. I nodded, and we turned back toward the passage. The descent was faster this time, our boots finding the familiar holds, our torches cutting through the dark with more confidence. When we reached the second chamber, I swept my light across the space until I found it, another opening, low and narrow, barely visible in the far corner. Fresh boot prints led toward it, faint but unmistakable. I crouched and shone my torch inside. The tunnel beyond was tight, the walls pressing in on both sides, the ceiling so low I'd have to crawl on my stomach. I glanced at Phil. "You good with tight spaces?" He shrugged. "Not really. But I'm not letting you go alone." I keyed the radio one more time. "Greg, we're pushing into the third tunnel. If we're not back in 30 minutes, tell emergency services we need a rescue team with caving gear." "Copy." I clicked off the radio, took a breath, and started into the passage. The tunnel pressed in on all sides, the stone cold and damp against my palms, my knees scraping limestone grit with every shuffling movement forward. Phil's breathing echoed behind me, steady but tight, and I could feel the weight of the rock above us like a hand pressing down on my chest. My torch beam bounced off the walls ahead, catching rough tool marks and patches of lichen that hadn't seen daylight since the war. The passage angled downward, twisting left, then right, narrowing until my shoulders brushed stone on both sides. I stopped, listening. Somewhere ahead, water dripped in slow, irregular beats. Phil's radio crackled softly against his hip. I kept moving. The tunnel opened suddenly into a space just wide enough to crouch, and I swept my torch across the walls, the floor, searching for any sign Jack had come this way. There, boot prints in the dust, heading toward another opening at the far end. I crawled forward, Phil close behind, and we pushed through into a chamber larger than the others, maybe 4 meters across, the ceiling high enough to stand. The air here was different, cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang I didn't like. My torch caught something against the far wall, and I moved closer, my pulse quickening. A swag, rolled tight and tied with paracord, a plastic crate stacked with tinned food, most of the labels faded to blank white. A camp stove, the kind you'd take on a long-range trek, set up on a flat stone with a blackened pot beside it. And next to the stove, a small pile of personal effects, a wallet, a faded photograph, a wristwatch with a cracked face. I picked up the wallet and opened it, angling my torch to catch the driver's license inside. Jack Pendleton's face stared back at me, younger, cleaner, his hair darker than I remembered. The license had expired 18 months ago. Phil crouched beside the crate, lifting a can of beans, checking the date stamped on the bottom. "This stuff's recent," he said quietly. "Last few months, most of it." I set the wallet down and turned slowly, scanning the rest of the chamber. There, another opening, smaller, darker, tucked behind a natural pillar of limestone. Fresh bootprints led straight toward it. I started forward, but Phil caught my arm. "David, look at this." He was pointing at the ground near the swag, his torch beam focused on a patch of stone that looked darker than the rest. I crouched beside him, and the metallic smell grew stronger. Blood. Not much, but enough to see where it had pooled and then been smeared, as if someone had tried to wipe it away. I followed the smear with my torch, and found more, drops leading toward the tunnel opening, uneven and spaced wide, like someone had been moving fast. Phil's voice was low. "Careful." Tommy said there was a struggle. I nodded, my throat tight. He said Jack panicked when he tried to leave. I stood and moved to the tunnel entrance, shining my torch inside. The passage beyond was narrow again, but not as tight as the last, and the walls showed more tool marks, deliberate and even, like someone had worked to widen it over time. I could see boot prints in the dust, leading deeper, and beside them, a thin, irregular line that might have been a hand dragged along the wall for balance. I turned back to the camp, my mind working through what we'd found. The supplies were too fresh for someone who'd been hiding for 2 years without resupply. That meant Jack had been moving in and out, somehow without anyone seeing him, maybe at night, maybe through a different entrance we hadn't found yet. The blood told a different story. Tommy had tried to leave, Jack had stopped him, and something had gone wrong. I thought about the journal entry Tommy had written, the fear in his words, the sense that Jack wasn't dangerous so much as desperate. A man who'd been living alone in the dark for that long wouldn't be thinking straight. He'd be reactive, defensive, seeing threats where there weren't any. Phil checked his radio, the crackle loud in the silence. "We've been down here 20 minutes, he said. "We push any further, we're past our safety window." I looked at the tunnel entrance, then back at the camp, weighing the choice. Jack was somewhere ahead, maybe injured, maybe armed, definitely afraid. If we turned back now, emergency services would have to start fresh, and by then he could be gone, deeper into a system we hadn't mapped, or worse, trapped by rising water if the storm runoff hit the creek bed above. But if we kept going and something went wrong, we'd be risking more than just ourselves. I made the call. "We go in," I said, "but slow, and we call out every few meters. If he knows we're coming, he's less likely to panic." Phil nodded, his jaw set, and we moved into the passage. The tunnel descended sharply, the floor slick with moisture, and I had to brace one hand against the wall to keep from sliding. My torch caught more blood drops, fresher this time, still tacky when I touched one with my fingertip. I called out, my voice echoing off the stone. "Jack, it's David Kerrigan from Wirralong. We found Tommy. He's safe. We're not here to hurt you, mate, we just want to talk." Silence. We kept moving. The passage twisted left, then opened into a smaller chamber, this one barely 2 meters wide, the ceiling so low I had to duck. My torch swept the space and caught movement at the far end, a figure pressed against the wall, one arm held tight across his ribs, his face pale and streaked with dirt. Jack Pendleton. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, his hair matted and his beard patchy and unkempt. His eyes were wide, darting between Phil and me, and I could see his chest heaving, with shallow, rapid breaths. His right hand was wrapped in a filthy cloth, stained dark. I held up one hand, palm out, and kept my voice low, steady. "Jack, we're not here to hurt you." He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at us like we were something he couldn't quite process. Phil stayed behind me, his torch angled low so it wouldn't blind Jack, his posture loose, non-threatening. I took a slow step forward. "Tommy told us what happened," I said. "He said you didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. He understands, mate. We all do." Jack's mouth opened, then closed, his voice coming out hoarse and cracked when he finally spoke. "He tried to leave. He was gonna tell them where I was." I nodded, taking another slow step. "I know, but he's safe now, and he's not pressing anything. He just wants to go home, same as you." Jack shook his head, the movement sharp, frantic. "I can't. There's debts. There's people looking for me. If I go back..." His voice broke, and he slid down the wall, his legs giving out, his injured hand pressed tight against his ribs. I could see the blood seeping through the cloth now, fresh and dark. I crouched, setting my torch on the ground between us, keeping my hands visible. "Jack, you're hurt. You need a hospital. Whatever you're running from, we'll figure it out, but not here, not like this." He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed, exhausted. "I can't go back," he whispered. "I can't." Phil moved forward slowly, pulling the first aid kit from his pack, and I glanced at him, then back at Jack. "You don't have to do it alone," I said. "But if you stay down here, you'll die. The creek's gonna flood in the next few hours, and these tunnels will fill faster than you can climb out. You know that." Jack's gaze drifted toward the passage we'd come through, then back to me, and I saw something shift in his expression, fear giving way to something heavier, something closer to resignation. He nodded, just once, and let his head fall back against the stone. I glanced at Phil and he nodded, already kneeling beside Jack with the first aid kit open. The cloth around Jack's hand was soaked through, and when Phil peeled it back gently, I could see a deep gash across the palm, ragged and inflamed. "This needs proper stitches," Phil said quietly. Jack didn't respond, just kept his eyes on the ceiling, his breathing shallow. I checked my watch and did the maths in my head. The storm had dumped water upstream hours ago, and the flow would be pushing through the dry creek system by now, building pressure against every narrow point. We had maybe 90 minutes before the lower passages started filling. "We need to move," I said. Jack's eyes flicked to me, then away. "Can you walk?" I asked. He nodded, but when Phil helped him to his feet he swayed, his good hand bracing against the wall. I moved to his other side and took some of his weight, and together we started back the way we'd come, Phil leading with the torch. The tunnel felt tighter on the spedder on the bot. Way out, the walls pressing closer, the air heavier. Jack stumbled twice in the first 50 meters, his legs barely holding him, and I could feel the heat coming off him, fever setting in from the infection. "Stay with us, mate," I said. He mumbled something I didn't catch, his head drooping. Behind us, faint and low, I heard the first sound of water moving through stone. It wasn't a roar yet, just a whisper, but it was enough to tighten the knot in my chest. "Phil, pick up the pace," I called ahead. Phil glanced back, saw the look on my face, and nodded, his torch beam sweeping faster across the walls. We reached the junction where the passage split, and I heard it again, louder now, the water finding its way through the cracks and fissures, pushing into spaces that had been dry for months. Jack's weight sagged heavier against me, and I adjusted my grip, half carrying him now. "Almost there," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was saying it for him or for myself. The sound of water grew steady, a low rumble that vibrated through the rock, and when we rounded the last bend, I saw the main chamber ahead, the light from the entrance shaft spilling down in a pale column. Relief hit me hard, but it didn't last. Water was already pooling at the base of the shaft, thin and fast-moving, spreading across the chamber floor in a dark slick. "Shit," Phil said, his voice tight. I scanned the shaft and saw the rungs we'd climbed down, still bolted to the stone, but the water was rising fast, knee-deep now in the lower section. "We go now," I said. Phil waded in first, the water cold and swift, his torch held high, and I followed with Jack, my boots slipping on the slick stone beneath the surface. Jack gasped when the water hit him, his body jerking, and I tightened my grip on his arm. "One step at a time," I said. The current tugged at my legs, not strong yet but building, and I could hear the roar upstream now, a deep, grinding sound like the earth itself was shifting. Phil reached the ladder and climbed fast, his torch clamped between his teeth, and when he reached the top, he turned and reached down. "Send him up," he called. I guided Jack to the rungs and he grabbed hold with his good hand, his injured hand pressed against his chest. He climbed slowly, each rung a struggle, his boots slipping twice, and I stayed below him, one hand braced against his back, ready to catch him if he fell. The water was waist-deep now, cold enough to steal my breath, and I could feel the pressure building, the flow accelerating. Jack reached the top and Phil hauled him over the edge, and I climbed fast, my arms burning, the water surging below me. I heard the crack before I saw it, a sharp sound like a gunshot, and when I looked down, the lower passage was flooding hard, a wall of brown water exploding into the chamber, carrying debris and silt. I pulled myself over the edge just as the water hit the base of the shaft, the force of it shaking the ground. Phil and I stood there, for a moment, breathing hard, watching the water churn below, and then I turned to Jack. He was lying on his side in the dirt, his eyes half closed, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. I pulled out my radio and keyed the mic. "David to all stations, we've got him. Requesting immediate medical evac at the old crossing, west side of the creek bed. One casualty, possible sepsis, needs hospital now." Rob's voice came back crackling and faint. "Copy that, David. Ambulance is 20 minutes out. We're on our way to your position." I knelt beside Jack and checked his pulse. It was fast, thready, but steady enough. Phil was already wrapping the hand properly, using clean gauze from the kit, his movements practiced and calm. "He's gonna need IV antibiotics," Phil said. I nodded. "He'll get them." Jack's eyes opened a crack and he looked at me, his voice barely a whisper. "Tommy?" "He's safe," I said. "At the hospital, dehydrated and banged up, but he's gonna be fine." Jack closed his eyes again, and I saw his shoulders relax, just a little. The sound of the flooded creek was loud now, a constant roar that drowned out everything else, and when I looked across the dry creek bed, I could see the water spreading wide, brown and fast, reclaiming the channels it had carved decades ago. Rob and 2 others arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a stretcher and a proper trauma kit, and we loaded Jack onto it carefully, strapping him down. The ambulance met us at the access road, lights flashing, and the paramedics took over without hesitation, starting a line, checking vitals, asking questions I answered as best I could. They loaded Jack into the back and the doors closed, and then the ambulance was gone, dust hanging in the air behind it. Rob stood beside me, his arms crossed, his face lined with exhaustion. "Hell of a way to spend an afternoon," he said. I didn't answer, just watched the dust settle, the sound of the creek still loud in the distance. Phil walked over, his pack slung over one shoulder, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Reckon that's the last time I go caving," he said. I managed a tired grin. "Yeah, same." We drove back to the station in silence, the ute rattling over the rough track, the sun low and red on the horizon. When we pulled into the yard, I saw Banjo standing near the fence line, his coat clean now, the blood washed away, his ears pricked forward. I walked over and ran a hand down his neck, and he leaned into the touch, calm and steady. "Good boy," I said quietly. He snorted once, then turned and walked back toward the paddock, and I watched him go, thinking about the weight of what he'd carried, the loyalty that had brought him home when everything else had gone wrong. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the mug of tea someone had made for me, too tired to drink it. My phone buzzed and I checked the screen. A message from the hospital. "Tommy stable. Jack in ICU. Prognosis cautiously optimistic." I set the phone down and closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion settle over me like a weight I'd been carrying for days. Response. Section 6-6. The next morning I woke early, my body stiff and aching, and drove back to the hospital in Mount Isa. The sun was barely up, the sky pale and soft, and the road stretched out empty ahead of me, the kind of quiet you only get before the heat settles in. Tommy was awake when I got there, propped up in bed with an IV line taped to his arm and a bruise spreading across his cheekbone. He looked thin and tired, but his eyes were clear, and when he saw me he managed a weak grin. "Go point to boss," he said. I pulled a chair over and sat down, setting my hat on the side table. "How you feeling?" "Like I got dragged behind a ute," he said. "But alive, so I'll take it." I nodded, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, just sat there in the quiet hum of the hospital, the beeping of monitors and the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I should have radioed in when I found the shelter, should have told someone where I was going." "Yeah, you should have," I said. "But you didn't know what you were walking into, and you made it out." He looked down at his hands, his fingers picking at the edge of the blanket. "Jack didn't want to hurt me," he said. "He was just scared, you know? Scared of what would happen if anyone found him." I leaned back in the chair, thinking about the man we'd carried out of the tunnels, the desperation in his voice, the weight of 2 years spent hiding from debts and mistakes he couldn't undo. "He's gonna face what he ran from," I said, "but he's getting help too. They're keeping him under observation, mental health teams involved." Tommy nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "I kept thinking, down there in the dark, that maybe I'd end up the same way," he said. "Just another bloke who disappeared into the outback and never came back." "But you did come back," I said, "and Banjo made sure of that." A small smile crossed his face. "Yeah, he did. Reckon I owe him a lifetime supply of carrots." I stayed another 20 minutes, talking through the details he remembered, the layout of the shelter, the way Jack had appeared out of the tunnels like a ghost, the storm that had driven Tommy inside in the first place. When I left, he was already drifting back to sleep, the exhaustion of the last few days catching up to him, and I walked out through the hospital corridor with a strange kind of relief settling in my chest. Jack's room was 2 floors down, in the ICU wing, and I stopped at the nurse's station to ask if I could see him. The nurse checked her screen and nodded, her expression neutral but not unkind. 10 minutes, she said. "He's still weak, but he's stable." I found him in a small room, with pale blue walls and a single window looking out over the car park, and when I walked in he turned his head slowly, his face pale and drawn. "David," he said, his voice rough. I pulled up a chair and sat down, the same way I had with Tommy, and looked at him for a long moment before I spoke. "You gave us a hell of a scare," I said. He closed his eyes, and I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the blanket. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said. I just needed time to figure things out, to get clear of the mess I'd made. 2 years is a long time to hide, I said. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and I saw something raw there, something that had been buried under the fear and the isolation. I didn't know how to come back, he said. Didn't know if anyone would even want me to. I thought about the station, the way people talked about Jack after he disappeared, the rumors and the speculation, the quiet assumption that he'd either done a runner or come to a bad end out in the scrub. People will have opinions, I said. Some of them won't be kind. But you're alive, and that counts for something. He didn't answer, just stared at the ceiling, and after a few minutes, I stood and turned toward the door. Jack, I said, and he looked at me. Tommy's gonna be fine. And whatever happens next, you're not alone in it. He nodded once, slowly, and I walked out, leaving him to whatever thoughts were turning over in his mind. Back at the station, the days fell into a rhythm again, the kind of steady routine that keeps a place like Wirralong running. The cattle were moved to fresh paddock, the bores checked and maintained, the fences walked and repaired where the storm had knocked posts loose. Banjo grazed in the home paddock, his coat glossy in the sunlight, and every time I saw him, I thought about the blood on his flanks, the way he'd carried the weight of Tommy's absence all the way home. Horses don't think the way we do, don't calculate risk or weigh consequences, but they know loyalty, and Banjo had shown more of it than most people manage in a lifetime. Phil stopped by one afternoon with a case of beer and we sat on the veranda, watching the sun drop toward the horizon, the sky turning gold and red. Heard Tommy's getting discharged next week, he said. Yeah, I said. Doc says he needs rest but he'll be right. Phil took a long pull from his bottle and set it down on the arm of the chair. And Jack, still in hospital, I said. They're moving him to a psych facility in Brisbane once he's stable enough. Legal stuff's gonna take time, but at least he's getting the support he needs. Phil nodded, his gaze distant. Reckon it's easy to lose yourself out here, he said. All this space, all this silence. Makes you think too much, or not enough. I didn't disagree. The Outback's a hard place, beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and it demands a kind of resilience that not everyone has. Jack had cracked under the weight of it, and Tommy had nearly paid the price, but they'd both made it out, and that was something. A week later, Tommy came back to the station, thinner but steady, and the first thing he did was walk out to the paddock and spend an hour with Banjo, just standing there with one hand on the horse's neck, the two of them quiet in the afternoon heat. I watched from the veranda and didn't interrupt, just let them have the moment, the kind of reunion that doesn't need words. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold in front of me, I thought about the shelter hidden beneath the dry creek bed, the tunnels that had swallowed 2 men and nearly kept them, the secrets that had been buried there for decades. The Outback holds a lot of stories, most of them untold, and some of them are darker than others. Jack's story was one of isolation and desperation, of choices made under pressure, and the long, slow unraveling that comes when you can't see a way forward. Tommy's story was one of luck and loyalty, of a horse that refused to leave him behind, and a search party that wouldn't quit. Both of them would carry the weight of what happened for the rest of their lives, but they were alive, and in the end, that's all you can ask for. I stood and walked out onto the veranda, the night cool and still, the stars scattered thick across the sky. Somewhere out there, in the vast interior, there are more shelters, more tunnels, more stories waiting to be found. If you've ever driven the long road at night, you know the silence, the way it presses in around you, heavy and endless. Hit like and subscribe. More stories are coming.